Each company that you're working with has a certain maturity for design. Some of them might have it be like the thing that's done off in the corner, where versus it's something that's done integrated throughout the company. And so you have to understand, where is the company at?
Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Welcome to episode 45. Today, Corey Stern, a senior user experience designer at the Nerdery, joins me to talk about how to mix UX and Agile, the state of design education, and what to look for in a company you want to work for as a designer. For 2 decades, Corey has been involved in client services, leading strategic engagements from sales and discovery through execution and implementation. And quickly before we get started, I wanted to mention that I'm scheduling some upcoming talks within local companies on how to build a growth mindset within a design and development team. If you, your team, or company could benefit from this kind of conversation, you can reach out to me at Kurt, that's K-U-R-T, at foundrymakes.com. That's Kurt at foundrymakes.com. And now, here's my conversation with Corey. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time to come down and hang out.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's hear a little bit about your background. How did you get involved in UX? Were you a young 4-year-old running around saying, I can't wait to iterate on design problems, and is that what the dream was?
Not exactly.
No, okay.
No,
all right.
But when I was younger, I wanted to do graphic design and web design work, and I had started working kind of in the late 90s on like CD-ROM related work.
As did I.
Yep. Moved on to doing e-commerce work, and eventually had worked in e-learning, a lot of e-learning work as well. So I just worked in a lot of different places and a lot of different project work, and now I'm doing UX work, which is for a wide variety of clients and a lot of different problems that we're solving.
Let's talk a little bit about you mentioned you've been doing user experience and design just in general for a long time, and I'm kind of an old dog when it comes to it as well. And let's talk a little bit about how it's changed over the years, right? So I remember one of the first user experience books I ever read. It was basically, sketch, wires, design, and that's user experience, and that's how you do it. And I know that in the past few years, you've worked on many different models around what user experience is and the different ecosystem that lives within it. Has user experience become more complex over the years, or is there just been more opportunity to explore the offering and the service?
There's definitely been more awareness, I would say, in the last 10 years. So I think that years ago, the term UX really wasn't used at all. But we had still kept in mind, obviously who the users were, what this was for, what the intention was. But we didn't explicitly do some of the things that we're doing today, where we're doing much more observation, ethnographic research, a lot of different methodologies that are used in user experience design, and doing more testing and doing a lot of different types of testing. So that wasn't a thing probably 20 years ago, at least when I was starting off. But now it's become more of a prevalent thing, more of a standard now to actually, validate that you're on the right track.
Yeah.
And to really learn what people need rather than just making assumptions. Even
10 years ago, it was still a bit more. Even though you were going through the architecture part of design, you were spending more time on it. It still was a bit genius design back in the early days, right? I mean, because where were you architecting from? What position were you starting from? It was more like, well, this is an easy way to communicate the design ahead of time, so I don't spend a ton of time putting together this crazy visual that you're just going to not like anyways. Right?
Yeah, there was a fair amount of guesswork then when you just had, it was the team would be working collaboratively together, but we're all just kind of making a lot of guesses and assumptions that this is what's needed for the end user, unless we actually had talked to them. And I know some of our in the early days of e-learning, a lot of our instructional designers would go talk to end users. So they would learn by observing like what they were doing on the job and taking those things under consideration when we're doing our design and development.
as that testing and that research and those things, I feel like there's and again, you can tell me if I'm crazy, but I remember years and years ago trying to convince people about the importance of UX and architecture and why that was important to map out these customer journeys and what the architecture is going to be way before we do any of these visuals or we start coding anything. And that was a challenge. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the challenge now that I'm seeing people experiencing is getting people comfortable with the testing early and showing things that might not be done early because that could reflect bad on my brand or what I'm trying to do. Have you seen that? And if you have, how have you counteracted those?
Yeah. So a lot of people tend to think, well, everything has to be pixel perfect and we can't show anybody anything until it's just right.
Yep.
And I think that's changing where you're coming up with ideas just to understand whether or not we're on the right path or not. Very early, very rough sketches, paper prototypes, online tests as well. So it could be any one of those things, but and it kind of depends on the speed at which you're working. If you have availability of those end users to do those tests in person, or if they have to be online. So there's a lot of different factors that go into like what's the right fit for what you're doing.
You want to get started. You're excited, right? You want to start solutioning very quickly. People want to get to work and just start doing stuff, right? And I mean, it's human nature, right? I see an opportunity, I see a problem, I'm going to start working on it. I'm going to start working towards it. In the sort of user research, insights-driven sort of approach, you need to take a step back first before you go in and start pulling out wires, right?
Right. You're making a pretty big assumption if you know everything that needs to go into the design and how to make the experience, work for like. Some people might not do the research up front, and the research could be as simple as, is there a market need for this? What are competitors doing? What does our existing platform do for our customers? How do we benchmark that? How do you measure that today, that experience today? Who do they need to reach out to? What kind of resources do they need? What kind of manual processes are they doing? It's really just understanding their behaviors and what kinds of challenges that they're going through, so that you have a better chance at providing a product that solves those problems.
Yeah, but again, if I'm someone who doesn't fully understand those processes, those things, that could look like a bunch of busy work up front, Corey, that I need to get this thing out the door. I'm excited. I need my new product or my new application or whichever. And you want to take a step back and you want to talk to people other than me when I'm paying you. Like, that's a challenge for some folks,
sure.
Right?
Yeah, it is a challenge because I think a lot of people have been doing it one way for many years, where they've been building products and they might not get the feedback until actually you've done the design, you've done the development, then you've launched it and marketed it. And then by the time it's marketed, then you finally get that feedback versus getting feedback on a regular basis throughout the design process, even through beta testing, through development, and then launching the product. And then having that confidence that you're going into the market with a product that's much more of a fit for users, something that's usable and useful.
And again, you're hoping that all this effort up front is going to save a lot of effort later, right? I mean, isn't that really the goal? Isn't that really the value sell for the client? It
is a value to prevent having to build something that's not necessary, or maybe they're only going to use 10% of the application that's most important for them, that they use most of the time. So focusing more attention on what are those things that they really need to do versus those things that are nice to haves, or the things that maybe that you thought were important but actually are not.
Yeah.
And you learn that through testing, and you learn that through that feedback and iterative design, having those opportunities to learn if you're on the right track or not.
Let's talk about measuring up front, right? Maybe I'm listening to this show and I'm thinking to myself, well, I understand measurement. That's where you install analytics on your site, or you put a mixed panel in your product, and now I'm getting insights, right? But How are you doing that during the user experience and the design and the architecture process in a way that is a way that you can make decisions from?
Yeah. Sometimes we'll have clients that will look at their analytics and think that is the source that we need, right? That's telling us where they're falling off in the process. It's telling us information about when they go to the site or where they're coming from, but it doesn't tell us enough about why. It's the quantitative data, but it doesn't provide the qualitative data. And so we want to get to understanding both of those things before we are making decisions. If we just relied on one or the other, then we really don't have enough information to make really good decisions. The other thing that's been helpful too is when I take product owners with me on site to see people actually go through a process or to learn about what's wrong with the software today, or the more I can get them involved in the process, the better it is for them to see what the problems are, where the pain points are, and it also feels like they have a stake in it where they can really see what's going on versus maybe what they had said were the problems initially. It's important to get those teams and even development involved as well, and project managers and others involved in that process. They can really, understand what's the problem that we're really solving, so that we know that then going through development that, this is what we're trying to accomplish because of these problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and with that research and that testing you're doing up front, you're setting better goals for what the next iteration of this product will be, or even if it's greenfield, you have some better idea of where the target is now, because the users are telling you, it's very important, obviously, that your stakeholder or your client or whoever has a great vision for what they want to provide to people. But it's really that end user that's going to tell you what is most valuable. And the more you get to learn that up front, the more opportunity you generate for that, the better.
Yeah, and it's one thing, too, if an end user says that they have a particular problem, but it's also another thing to actually see them go through the activity, because you're going to learn a lot from that as well. So you want to observe people because you're going to see them do things that they didn't really tell you about before, like very specific things. Maybe that they go to another website or use a competitive product, or when you actually watch them go through a process, you didn't know that they had a giant binder of things that they were referencing, or sticky notes on their computer, or whatever that is. And you can start to learn, why is that? Why, and if you can have that discussion with them and really walk through that process, then you can really learn, there are opportunities here to make this a better experience where they don't have to go back to reference those things.
Right, yep. Exactly. And so that's, the kind of side of helping the client or the stakeholders understand the value of doing that. What about with development? When developers, they want to get started, let's start building some stuff. I'll lay down some frameworks, and we'll start, building out some of maybe the APIs and the features and things. I mean, is that okay to do while design is getting started, or do they really need to wait to really start to understand what the solution needs to be?
In some cases, we have had development do some work up front, but in most cases, we're working collaboratively just to understand what we're solving first, and really clearly defining that so that we can then target what the right platform, what are the right feature sets that we're building out, those kinds of things, and that's a collaborative process with them. That designers will do with development, and it never really should be a waterfall type process where you're designing out everything and you're just handing off to them. Instead, you're working collaboratively with them so that you're making sure all along the way that what you're designing is feasible as well. Because if we were to design things and we're going to be making assumptions about things, or maybe we could use a plugin for certain things, or maybe there are things, maybe they're more knowledgeable about the system that we're building for, like the design patterns, these kinds of very specific granular things. So the more that you have them involved, the more that they can have that collaborative help and working through a problem versus just that typical handoff where, design does something and then development's estimates are 3 times the cost or whatever it is. And so you can avoid those things if you're working more collaboratively in the first place.
Sure. And so let's say I'm listening to this. I love everything Corey's saying, but my organization is not set up in order to support that sort of thing. We typically have handoffs, or we have to finish all of design before development will even talk to us, or maybe our processes are not in a good place to help us do that. What advice would you give somebody to get started into having that better relationship with development if they feel right now it's maybe more of a siloed part of the process?
Part of it is education. Part of it is kind of showing what does Agile look like? What could that look like? So it's part education from those that are product owners, your Scrum Master. Different people on the project will be able to kind of explain then what the benefits are with working together. So it's a part education process, but it's also part of an organizational process. Are they ready to dedicate resources to be in an Agile environment? Maybe they're working part-time on different things in the organization, and they're not dedicated to the product. So they might have to have changes in their organization to their talent, their dedication to the product.
There's a lot of people that have maybe made the move to Agile, but that's on a development scale. They have a difficult time understanding how to involve user experience in an Agile process or an Agile project. And how have you seen success? I mean, I've seen it everything from we'll give design 2 weeks head start, and now we're going to be Agile. Is that how it works?
No, I don't. No.
Darn it!
Yeah,
I thought it was that easy.
No, not that easy. It depends on what is the information that we have, and do we have a clear enough direction to move forward with design and development. If we don't, then we have to kind of take a step back and say what do we really need here to really understand the product that we're building. And so it's not a typical time-boxed 2 weeks, of learning, because sometimes in order to make those changes, you might need to take a little bit of extra time to work through a design and iterate on that before you're providing wireframes or prototypes to the development QA teams.
And what about if I'm a designer or I'm a developer and I'm working in those Agile teams, but I'm feeling something's off. I'm feeling like things are not running in an Agile way. If it's maybe this is just Agile theater or Scrum or Fall or something, and we're not actually. I mean, what does Agile mean to you, Corey, when you're thinking about it with your design hat on, right? As a team member, but also as a leader within a design team, kind of working towards that. When you think of Agile, how do you go about approaching setting people up for success?
I think that in my experience, the products that have had really good working relations with development and product owners are when they're collaborative in a space, a shared space together.
Sure,
and they're co-located, where you have visibility to see what people are working on, share what you're working on, and have those places where they can see what's being designed and developed, even like posting up on whiteboards or whatever is in your area, showing flows or showing changes to design, having those regular meetings with those teams, even if they're located outside of the building, in other areas, you can have those conversations still and feel like you're making changes and having momentum. And it is having those tools that also can track your development as well. So not just the physical, but also the digital tools that you're using to make sure that everyone can see that progress and understand what something does, how does it function, how does it work, and providing those designs or prototypes and annotations.
Because again, I love that you said, it's really about that open and transparent communication and being not even just being that communicator, but being available to be communicated with, right? That's good part of the co-locating part, is that you you're can visibly and physically see you and walk up to you and talk to you about what's happening and how it's happening. And people just communicate better face to face than they do virtually. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yeah. I mean, there are challenges to it. It can work, but you have to then make sure that you're planning for that you have that time to make sure.
It's got to be deliberate.
Yes,
right? You can't just assume, I'm going to put you in a room with some beanbags and some whiteboards and you'll figure it out, right? Isn't that how it works?
No.
Oh, man.
Sorry.
You're just popping all my balloons today, Corey. But with that, let's talk about a little bit about the research side of things, because it's something that I find fascinating. Is that, I had Jeff Godelf on the show, Lean UX, talking through, one of the questions I had for him is, can we get any leaner? Like, can we get teams down to like 2 people and still be successful, right? Is that where we're going? Is that where we're headed? Is for lean? But when you talk about research, user research and validation can be a big rabbit hole, right? How do you know when to stop? Like, how do you know when enough is enough and feel confident that you're being lean, right? You're having agility, you're being lean, you're following what is going to be helpful. But I mean, I could spend years doing a study on how people order Chipotle through an application.
Sure. I'll say it depends. It depends on the problem that you're solving. So if it's a big, wicked problem, those things can take years to potentially,
Sure.
to learn more to how to solve that. But if your problem that you're solving is very specific, you might be able to focus in on that and be able to then show progress fairly quickly. So it depends on the problem that you're solving, I would say.
Well, in product development versus a project, I mean, that research is never done, right? You're constantly doing it. And so it's not something that is just a front-loaded thing. We got our research. I've got it buttoned up in my little binder here, and we can refer to it later. It's something that you would encourage people to continue to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So throughout the product life cycle, you're going to continue to get feedback and learn from your customers or end users. And that process never does stop. I think that it's not a one and done process at all.
Sure.
You want to see patterns. I think you asked me earlier about like, when do you stop? Well, you could stop if you start to see patterns that emerge where people are having problems with these certain things, or they have all these kind of different pain points throughout their process. So you can start to collect those and then have a better direction at where to focus your attention. Does it make sense to solve these particular problems? Is there enough of an incentive for the business to go after these problems as well? What does that mean for the business? So it's taking a lot of those different things under consideration. How frequently do these things happen? What's the severity of these problems? So taking a lot of different considerations.
What about personas when it comes to that user research? Honestly, Corey, like if I was to go to Twitter and type in personas, I get 16 different opinions about them. Some people very animated about how stupid it is. Other people saying it doesn't matter. Other people saying it is everything. Other people confused on what a marketing persona is versus a user persona is. Where do you stand on it? What's your opinion on personas and then the way to either use them, not use them, or apply them or not apply them?
Well, Kurt, you're right. If you just were to Google that, you'd probably see a lot of different examples, and I really wouldn't recommend anyone to do that. Like to just start randomly like looking all over for things. Since I do teach UX design, I had a student that did that as well, where she had found some personas that were done and had kind of seen those and thought those were like good models to reference. And I had to explain that the reason why those are not good personas to reference as like a starting point is that they're not really talking about the behaviors. They're instead displaying
demographic information.
Yep, demographic information, or they're presenting things that are not really. It's not easy to put facts behind, or they're not things that are or true, and like they could be just completely made up. Those are the worst personas, right?
Right.
The ones that are just I call them like conceptual personas, where you've got a concept of maybe that this person might be doing these things, another person might be doing these things, but again, you don't really know them, you haven't talked to them, and to design those kind of leads people potentially down a wrong direction when you have a lot of assumptions. So try not to document assumptions, try to actually document fact through research.
Yeah. I've also seen in some cases where maybe just to unhinge a conversation or get to the next phase, a proto persona, or like you said, a fake persona might be able to help kind of get the next step. Like, we'll stop talking about anecdotally about who we're talking about. Let's just agree that this is sort of an area, and then we can move on and actually start to figure out who these people are and how they get done what they're doing. I mean, have you experienced that sort of roadblock before, where there's a lot of anecdotal talk about who the user is and why they're who they are, and then that can sometimes turn a churn within a team or within a product owner or a business because people can't agree who the end user really is?
Absolutely, that can be a problem. Again, it goes back to like what information do they have to make these decisions from? If they don't have the information, then we'd have those discussions.
Corey, I started this business 50 years ago,
sure.
So I have all the information.
Yeah, and in some cases, you can go about it by saying, okay, we will take your word for that, and then we can go forward with a very rough prototype then.
Right.
And through that prototype testing, you can also try to squeeze in some interviews with that end user if you've got time to do that. It might not be something that you're formally doing, but it might be something that you're able to get to work in your product design.
Right.
So does that answer your question? Or?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, again, like I said, there's sometimes weird roadblocks that you run into in the UX and design profession, and because it is new as a service offering, right? I mean, it's not technically new. I mean, there's been human factors and all these different things in some form or shape around for a long time, but in the digital space, there's so many new type of roles that people are still trying to figure out these things. And that's why I said at the beginning, like, I feel like user experience started out as a very light sort of like nice to have at the beginning. And now it's turned into a much more larger, robust, everything from, like you said, there's the users and the identifying who they are, where they're at, all those different things, all the way down to the analytics and the research and those types of things around there. So the role has gotten split between so many different things that a UX person these days is, you're a visual designer, you're an architecture person, information architecture, content strategist, analytics, even data science in some way is a lot around user experience too, right? Where you're tracking how people are in mass are using information. So, where do you see user experience going over the next year? Is it going to be more fragmented? Is it going to be, is it going to consolidate? Like, how do you see the future? And again, I'm not asking you to, guess here, but in your own opinion, over the next few years, if you were coaching a UX person on areas that to watch out for and things to be knowledgeable of, what would be some of your suggestions? So
I wrote an article probably about 4 years ago on the topic of how UX is a team sport. And I had a diagram that kind of shows that, you do have all these different roles. And I think it depends, again, on what the problem is that you're trying to solve.
Sure.
And also the resources that you have available. But I think that teams in general are going to have a need for being more user centered and more understanding of who you're building for. And it should be across design, product owner, development, and that people have just a very strong awareness and understanding of what you're building and why, and can point back to that research, and so you're involving different people potentially because you're again, you might have a stronger need for content strategy in one project versus another, where there, maybe it's more of a interaction design role, depending on what it is. But you might have teams that are either working together or split up, just depending on the project.
Sure. So it isn't just a one size fits all when you're building a user experience team, right? It's like you were saying, depends on the space you're in. You might have more heavy on this side than that side, versus, right, just building like a cookie cutter sort of team, right?
Yeah. Are we talking a mobile app? Because there are designers that are just focused on mobile. Are we talking a marketing site? People can be focused on content and the architecture of those sites, or maybe a news site, that
Sure. requires
a lot of information architecture work as well. So it just really depends on the product that you're building.
Let's say I'm a designer in a small team, and I'm trying to attain all these best practices that people keep talking about, and I read the Twitters and the Facebooks, and I follow these people, and I watch the YouTube videos, and everybody's telling me that we need to do it this way, but my company won't do it this way, and I really think that we need to institute this new sort of offering or this tool or whichever. As that person who is expected just to hopefully get the work done and focus on that, how do you also find a way to influence within your organization, within your team, with your peers? How have you found success, Corey, in being able to balance your job, right, versus improving the practice overall within your organization?
Well, each company that you're working with has a certain maturity for design. Some of them might have it be like the thing that's done off in the corner, versus it's something that's done integrated throughout the company. And so you have to understand, where is the company at? Are they taking those first steps and you need to educate them more often, or are you working with them and they have kind of a process and you're kind of fitting into that? And so I think it's just understanding the organization first, how mature are they as an organization, and who are you working with? What's their understanding?
And is that a good fit for where I'm at right now? Right.
Right. So it is like having that communication with them up front to understand where they are in that process in their own journey.
And I've had a number of other fantastic user experience professionals like yourself on the show, Corey, and I always ask them this question. Let's say I'm a new graduate from one of these boot camps, and I'm trying to look for that first job, or maybe I'm getting close to graduation. I'm starting to really get nervous, and I'm starting to think about, like, where should I go? I like to ask this question. In your opinion, where you're at now in your career, would you coach somebody to join a much larger organization, or would you coach them to try and aim for those smaller organizations?
There's a couple of things I'd bring up to this designer. I would say, do you want to be a specialist or do you want to be a generalist? Do you want to like kind of do all of the things in design? All
but
those
I don't know,
disciplines?
Corey. What should I do?
Well, after the students have gone through the UX program that I've done, they'll have a better understanding, and I can also kind of see like where they gravitate towards as well. If they want to work in a larger organization, typically they might have opportunities to be more specialized, where they might just do research or just information architecture. But if they're working at a smaller company, they might be wearing a lot of different hats. Right. So that's one thing to take under consideration. As
they kind of go out and they start talking to other organizations, it can be confusing because this person's hiring a senior UX person, but it doesn't look like the job description matches this position, or this person's looking for a researcher, but it says they need to have experience with design. It can get confusing, right?
It can be very confusing because the applications that you might see or the job descriptions you might see can have a lot of different variety, where you might have development included, or there's other responsibilities that seem outside of the the core responsibilities of a designer. So you want to look out for those things. Kind of going back to what you talked about earlier about with if you're fresh out of a boot camp and you're looking to do work as well, another thing I'd recommend too is make sure that you're working with real clients. Right. Put together a portfolio with real examples of your process, show your process, really talk about what were the problems that you solved and how did you measure that. A lot of designers I think that they might put together portfolios on sites like Behance or other things that might look great.
They're focused on the visual, right?
But the ones that are hiring are going to really try to dig into what about that project solved a problem?
Mm-hmm. What was the impact?
Yep. What was the measurable impact?
Makes sense. So again, going back to that, you don't need a huge team. If you're a solo designer, I mean, you can do a lot of the things you're talking about, the testing and all those pieces, even if you're just the only user experience person there. Or like you mentioned, maybe they're doing it as a freelance sort of a gig or something to build up for their portfolio. You don't need a ton of teams and resources and things to make these things happen, right?
Well, I encourage the designers to try to get as much exposure to working with developers as possible. So if they can actually build something or even work at a company part-time, whatever that is, or in an internship, getting that exposure to work collaboratively is actually a huge part of being a great designer as well.
If you, Corey, were talking to somebody who was working as a user experience professional in an organization and they want to move up the chain, right? They want to get more responsibility. They want to expand their knowledge and all these things. What advice do you give people? Like, what should they just focus on being the best designer and then they're going to become the king of the world in their organization? Is that how it works? Is that the best designer wins?
I think that if they're in their organization, they should look to their peers to see who is senior there or principal at their company and see if there are opportunities to learn from them, either through mentorship or through doing shadowing or project work with them. More exposure to doing the work too with them in collaboration will also help give you feedback. So it's having that experience, but also going outside of the building too. So go to the conferences, join the meetups. Yep. And those things, because you're going to learn from people outside that might be in different companies, very different companies that might be solving very different problems. And also just look to see, and really try to think critically, like, what do you want to do? What is your goal of also leveling up?
Yeah.
Like, what is your goal to manage people? Why do you want to do that? Or what's your ultimate goal? Do you want to help more people? What's your the outcome that you're trying to achieve? So really try to think critically about that as well.
And I would say to double down on that, if you don't know what your goal is, that means you should be out even more, meeting with more people and talking with more people, because that's how you're going to find that, right? I mean, I've had that where I've mentored young designers coming out of a program, and they're like, I'm not sure what I should focus on. I'm like, well, I can't just tell you. You've got to experience it. And so I love all the things that you brought up, Corey, about getting some freelance work or getting somebody else to bring you in with them as they're doing some work, or internships, or just going to those meetup groups, participating in those things, interacting with people, asking questions, making yourself a part of the community, even though you might feel a little intimidated because you're not technically maybe a user experience professional just yet, right? Being a part and being around and surrounded by that community is going to get you there faster than it is sitting at home watching Game of Thrones, right?
Right. The other thing I'll throw in too is think about what do you use most often for your social media. So if you're on Twitter, there's tons of people on Twitter that you can follow and see, like, what are they talking about now. So keeping on top of that as far as what kind of new things that they're working on, or events that they're attending, or technologies, those kinds of things. So think about those social media channels too, following industry professionals.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different places out there, and there's groups. There's all these different things. Be a part of it. Get excited about it. Start having those conversations. And the one thing that I would say is, like, I get it. You feel a little intimidated, but that vulnerability will allow you to be a better sponge if you just accept it.
The other thing too, to add to, like, if they're trying to move up in their career is to really write it down too. keep it in your own diary or your own document of like what you're trying to achieve, and have it be a regular thing that you look back on. And did I accomplish those things? Do I not have many things in my to-do list of things I want to try to accomplish in my career? So it's also to have that own place of reflection.
Corey, we're going to wrap up here, but I want to thank you for joining me. If I want to find out more about what Corey's up to and where are good places to interact with you and find out more, maybe I have some questions from this, or you inspired me with some things and I want to reach out, what are good places to find?
Twitter and LinkedIn.
Okay, that's great. I will put links to all those things in the show notes and on the website. Corey, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Kurt.